Chris Paul being on the Warriors is a little weird. This is someone that was basically an enemy of the Warriors fan base and franchise when he was in Houston. He doesn't like the team, and now all of a sudden he's playing with all of those guys. And this trade specifically has a lot of nuance to it and makes me think that it's one of the most misunderstood trades of the entirety of the offseason. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about some comments made recently by Chris Paul insinuating that he does not want to come off the bench for the Warriors. And that makes total sense. I mean, Chris Paul has been an unbelievable player for a long, long time. And even at this stage of his career, as he's gotten older, he's still been a starting player. He was a starting point guard in the finals a couple of years ago and was a really important piece for Phoenix and for Oklahoma City and for Houston and for the Clippers, every single team that he's been on. So why would he suddenly think that he would be coming off the bench? But when they first made this deal, my immediate reaction was that Chris Paul was going to be a player coming off the bench. Now, I have full faith and full confidence that the Warriors are going to figure this out, and that if it means potentially getting to the finals or winning a championship for Chris Paul, he'd be willing to do whatever it is that they ask of him. But I think the concept for this trade initially had two main, points to it. One was Chris Paul basically replacing Jordan Poole in the rotation. He's going to play 20 to 25 minutes in the regular season. Maybe in the postseason that gets bumped up, but those are not starter level minutes. The Warriors already have their starting lineup in terms of what it should look like, where it's going to be, for most of the regular season, a traditional big like Kevon Looney, Draymond, Wiggins, Klay, Steph. Like, that's the lineup. There's not a ton of space in there for Chris Paul. And even if, depending on the matchup, you want to put Draymond at the 5 and put Chris Paul back there alongside Steph, it's a lineup that just doesn't really make that much sense together based off of how Chris Paul has played throughout the entirety of his career. So this is going to be a move where, yes, Chris Paul is going to come off the bench. Like, he's just going to have to be okay with that. And the reason why that's really important for Golden State is their issue, even in the year that they won the title, has always been, how can they play better when Steph Curry is not on the floor? How can they maintain a good offense? How can they maintain a better rating when Steph isn't playing? And that, I think, is the genius of the Chris Paul trade, because they have the spacing and they have the players to make a Chris Paul-centric lineup work. And as a playmaker and as a creator, he is a significant upgrade over Jordan Poole, who is more of just a scorer. Jordan Poole's not someone that you can just put out there and say, hey, carry the second unit for us. Chris Paul can be that guy with the proper infrastructure around him. And so I do think that eventually they're going to get that figured out and he's going to come off the bench. But there's a second point to this trade that never really gets discussed for whatever reason, and that's the money of it all. The whole reason, in my opinion, that they made the trade, and outside of the actual basketball Chris Paul coming off the bench stuff we just talked about, was to save money. They just signed Jordan Poole to this massive contract after the Draymond punch. Like, things got weird in Golden State, and they realized quickly this is not a good value contract for us. Jordan Poole is a fine player, but if we want to try and maximize our ability to win a championship while Steph is still here, Chris Paul is an upgrade for us, and he saves us a ton of money. Chris Paul is on an expiring contract. If things go well next year, Golden State can re-sign him for much, much cheaper than the deal that he's on right now, and more importantly, much cheaper than the deal that Jordan Poole was going to be on for the remainder of the next 4 years, right? They tried to do the two timeline thing. They tried to have Kuminga and Wiseman and Poole and Moody and all these guys together working alongside the veterans, and they've basically completely abandoned that plan now, and that's a really significant part of this deal that never really gets talked about. And as long as Chris Paul is okay coming off the bench, which I think eventually he will be, I think this trade makes a ton of sense for Golden State, both in terms of on and off the basketball court. But no one also really talks about this from the perspective of the Wizards either. It's why I wanted to make this video, because I hadn't even talked about how this deal all worked together. Washington is doing all the right things here, in my opinion, in this offseason. They didn't get a ton in exchange for Beal, and that's because of the no trade clause. It's not this front office's fault. But getting players like Jordan Poole, retaining players like Kyle Kuzma, getting some stuff back in exchange for Beal, all of that is a good idea for them. Like, Jordan Poole, even if you don't think he's a great player, maybe he's a little bit annoying to watch at times, he's still going to put up numbers, and he's still going to look valuable, potentially more valuable in Washington than he did in Golden State. He can score, he can play make a little bit, and maybe they'll be able to turn that into an asset down the road. Maybe that'll just kind of keep their team at least a little bit respectable. But this deal makes a ton of sense for the for the Wizards as well. And all in all, I really think people are misunderstanding the point of this, and people are starting to freak out about, oh my gosh, Chris Paul doesn't want to come off the bench. What in the world are the Warriors going to do? they're going to figure it out. It's what they do. Like, it's not like there's really a conversation or discussion to be had with Chris Paul. You can't look at this lineup and say, hey, we're going to have Clay run at the 3, Wiggins at the 4, and then Draymond's going to play the 5 all the time just so that you can start. It makes so much more sense for Chris Paul to come off the bench. We've seen this in recent years with players like Russell Westbrook and players similar to that, where it's like, okay, we know you've been this guy for a long time, but now you're going to be a 6 man and you're going to be so much better at it. Our offense is going to work so much better when you're the primary guy. Chris Paul still, largely, his value lies in him being an on-ball player, and you could make the argument that putting Steph off the ball and having all this shooting around Chris Paul is going to be really great for him, but it's going to be so much more effective in the second unit because they need that stuff way more in that unit than they do with the starters. To me, I think it's a fantastic deal. I'm really excited to see how it works out, and I don't really understand why exactly everybody thinks this is going to be some gigantic issue. Now, the other part of this is if for whatever reason, Chris Paul is just like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be a bench guy. Put me somewhere else. They can always just cut him. It's a non-guaranteed contract. They can just release him and say, you know what? We're going to save some money on the deal. We salary dump Jordan Poole and Chris Paul can go play elsewhere. Like, that would be a pretty dramatic option, but they do still have that out for a team that wants to certainly maintain their chemistry after the crazy last offseason with, the Jordan Poole situation. Now, it's unlikely that they would go that route because if they just cut him, then one of the other good teams around the league is going to pick up a good player in Chris Paul, potentially a starter for them. So it's unlikely, but it is still an option for them. Chris Paul is a player that is well respected and has had a really good career, but he's never reached the championship heights that the majority of this Golden State roster has. And if he wants to get to that level, even as a bench player, he needs to agree to be a bench player. Like, that's just, and it's going to be better for his career at this point as well. They don't need Chris Paul to be starting and playing 30 minutes a game during the regular season. They need him to play 20 minutes a game in the regular season. They need him to play 25 to 30 in the postseason when they shrink their rotation down. And there are going to be times where he's going to be able to play alongside Steph, Clay, Wiggins, and Draymond. Like, that's a lineup that they're going to use. But it doesn't make sense to use up half or 3/4 of his minutes in that scenario by having him start during the regular season. And I think it's just a misunderstanding of the point of the trade and how the trade was supposed to work. Primarily, it saves them money. Secondarily, it gives them a player off the bench that works well with the players that they have. It was never intended to add the 5th starter to this group. They already have exactly what their starting lineup needs to look like. And I really, really hope that it works out for him, because even if it is as a bench player, 6-man, whatever, Chris Paul having a championship, if I think Golden State is going to be a contender this year, would be absolutely massive for his career. It's something that he needs to have on his resume for a lot of people to really come full circle on Chris Paul. I know it's going to be a little bit of a weird situation because of his relationship with that franchise and that fan base in the past, but he is still a professional. I do think he's going to fit in some really interesting ways in Golden State, and I can't wait to see how it works out.